Freeland shocks the nation, boasts about driving away vital investment. Is Canada at risk? Canada's political and economic future is facing intense scrutiny as Finance Minister Freeland's recent remarks have sent shockwaves across the nation. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney, the Liberal government is advancing policies that many Canadians feel are stripping away personal freedoms, driving up costs, and pushing away critical investment needed for sustained growth. Central to this upheaval is the highly controversial electric vehicle (EV) mandate, which requires that by 2026, 20% of all new vehicles sold in Canada be electric, escalating to a full ban on new gas-powered vehicle sales by 2035. This aggressive timeline is raising alarms across the country. Promoted by the government as a necessary and bold climate initiative, the EV mandate is increasingly viewed as a form of coercion rather than choice. Canadians who value affordability and freedom feel cornered by a policy that forces an expensive transition to electric vehicles, many of which remain out of reach for average families. With EVs often costing up to $20,000 more than their traditional counterparts, the mandate disproportionately impacts working-class Canadians and rural residents. For those living outside urban centers, the lack of reliable charging infrastructure and the strain on local power grids make widespread EV adoption highly impractical, creating serious doubts about the policy's viability and fairness. While Ottawa insists this plan broadens consumer options, the reality paints a different picture. The surge in global EV adoption is primarily fueled by massive government subsidies in China, a market vastly different from Canada's. Many leading economies, including parts of Europe and North America, have begun scaling back their EV mandates amid sluggish consumer uptake and skyrocketing costs. Canada's unilateral push risks isolating the country from global trends, burdening its citizens with inflated prices and limited vehicle choices. Political commentator Jasmine Lane has been outspoken about these contradictions, pointing out the stark contrast in parliamentary engagement. While opposition parties such as the Greens, Bloc Québécois, NDP, and Conservatives have expressed willingness to work through the summer to address pressing national issues like rising crime rates, the Liberals have opted instead to fast-track vague legislation and quickly retreat on extended holidays. This apparent political complacency frustrates Canadians who expect proactive leadership amid mounting challenges. Lane also draws attention to Canada's ballooning national debt, which has soared from $700 billion in 2020 to over $1.26 trillion today under Mark Carney's economic stewardship. Despite his reputation as a financial expert, critics argue Carney's tenure has coincided with runaway inflation and unsustainable government spending, casting doubt on the government's fiscal responsibility. Canadians face the harsh reality of mounting debt with little sign of corrective action. Among the most contentious government moves is Bill C-5, a sweeping law empowering cabinet ministers to override up to 13 federal statutes, including those protecting the environment, Indigenous consultation rights, and fisheries, for projects labeled as of national interest. Although some Conservatives supported the bill, hoping it would expedite infrastructure and resource developments, many now fear it dangerously undermines democratic oversight and concentrates excessive power in the executive branch. Lane warns that Bill C-5 could act as a Trojan horse, enabling the Liberals, under Carney's technocratic vision, to consolidate control over Canada's economy and critical infrastructure. What is pitched as pro-growth legislation might actually pave the way for unchecked government overreach, bypassing essential public debate and weakening accountability in the process. Canada's once thriving auto sector is also bearing the brunt of these policies. The EV mandate threatens approximately 38,000 jobs as manufacturers like Ford cut back on Canadian EV production amid poor consumer demand and waning government incentives. The promise that this mandate would create and protect jobs rings hollow when industry insiders reveal layoffs and plant closures. The policy appears less about safeguarding workers and more about advancing ideological goals at the expense of livelihoods. Compounding concerns, much of the EV supply chain, from batteries to solar panels and wind turbines, is dominated by foreign manufacturers, particularly Chinese firms. This reality raises uncomfortable questions about who ultimately benefits from Canada's EV push. While multinational corporations and global investors stand to profit handsomely, Canadian workers and families face rising prices, reduced options, and uncertain job prospects. Meanwhile, Canada's traditional energy sector is hampered by restrictive laws like Bill C-69, which has effectively stalled pipeline expansions and made new oil and gas projects almost impossible to develop. Lane also calls out the Liberals for their manipulative messaging. The government routinely frames the EV mandate and related policies as efforts to enhance affordability and consumer freedom. Yet behind the scenes, manufacturers face stiff fines, up to $20,000 per gas vehicle sold outside quota limits, costs inevitably passed on to buyers. This punitive system restricts supply, drives up prices, and narrows consumer choice, contradicting official claims. When opposition parties point out these issues, the government deflects blame, accusing critics of opposing affordability measures. However, Lane exposes how hidden clauses and ideological strings in Liberal legislation have made many of these bills unacceptable to the public and opposition alike. This disconnect between political rhetoric and lived experience deepens Canadian cynicism and distrust toward the current administration. Under Mark Carney's leadership, Canada's economic and political direction appears increasingly shaped by technocratic priorities and the interests of elite global finance rather than the needs of everyday citizens. The EV mandate, Bill C-5's power grab, and the curtailing of the energy sector suggest a government pursuing a controversial vision that risks alienating voters and stalling economic progress. As Canadians prepare for the snap federal election on April 28, 2025, the stakes couldn't be higher. The public must decide whether to endorse sweeping mandates and centralize control in pursuit of a green future or to demand policies that balance environmental goals with economic freedom, democratic accountability, and respect for individual choice. Minister Freeland's recent remarks have cast a stark spotlight on these issues, shocking many who fear that vital investment is being driven away, jobs are being lost, and freedoms are being curtailed. The coming months will be critical in determining Canada's path forward, whether toward increased government control or a renewed focus on choice, opportunity, and prosperity for all Canadians.